May God's spoken word become the living word, and the living word become incarnate through our lives. Amen. I think that sometimes it's every preacher's sort of dread that as you hear the readings, you realize you've prepared your sermon on the wrong readings. But what happened was that there was some sort of miscommunication. I had understood that last weekend you celebrated Epiphany and that today would be the baptism of Jesus. So you're actually getting now 2 for the price of 1, because you did the baptism last weekend and you're going to have it again today. However, I can say something about our gospel, because it feeds very nicely into all of what we understand and, of course, part of the mystery of baptism. It's fascinating, isn't it, that when Pilet comes and talks to Nathanael about Jesus, and Nathanael has that very prejudiced response like, come on, you've got to be serious. How can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip doesn't say to him, how dare you be so judgmental? You know, just wait and meet Jesus first and then you can decide. He doesn't say that. He just says, come and see. And I wonder if that isn't the challenge for us also as Christians. Instead of trying to defend God and Jesus and so on when people challenge our faith, why not just say, well, come and see. Come and see, come to church, see how you encounter the Lord in the community, in my life, in your life, and hopefully that will be enough of a conviction, because that is right from the moment of our baptism at any age. We are saying to Jesus, I am willing to grow in grace and faith that anybody may come and see you in me and through me. So in case you hadn't put it together, we have got an interesting thing that happens liturgically in the church, because we go straight from the Magi visiting the toddler Jesus. By then he's probably 18 months, 2 years old. And then we jump to the baptism of Christ. And we very quickly have this leap of faith in the space of a week, from a 2-year-old to an adult 30-year-old man. There's such scarcity of information about the ages that we skip out, except that one little pericope when Jesus is 12 years old, and we read about him and his parents going to Jerusalem and him being in the temple and speaking with the scribes there. Go and have a read again about Jesus at that age. It's in Luke chapter 2, beginning at verse 41. When we reflect on it, it's quite startling and extraordinary when we realize that 3/4 of Jesus' life on earth was hidden. We know almost nothing about it. In other words, for most of his life, Jesus lived a very ordinary, unexceptional life with his earthly family. And perhaps this is one of the ways in which God points out to us that there is greatness to be found in ordinary daily life when we live the simplicity of faithfulness. I also think that it seems to indicate that in God's eyes, nothing is too mundane or too commonplace that God won't invest in every gesture, every moment of the ordinary, so that even the simplest thing can have something of the hiddenness of God touching and imbuing it with holiness. As we know, Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan. And geographically, if you were to go and look at a map, the River Jordan is a border, and it's a border between the wilderness and the sort of desert-like area and the promised land. Theologically, on a spiritual level, that represents a threshold, liminal space. And with God in Jesus, not only immersed in water, but also immersed in human flesh, the River Jordan portrays a liminal space between life as pure survival and life that is thriving and abundant. It becomes a kind of border between sin and forgiveness, between the tomb, which is like the desert, and the womb, represented in the river, the water. And that is then encapsulated in the sense of death and life. And we have those words in our baptism service. So Jesus' baptism marks an important transition in God's ongoing work in the world. That kind of threshold experience is not only for them, but we have those sorts of borders, those sorts of movements in various ways throughout our lives. Sometimes it'll feel like those liminal spaces are times of intense loss, grief, fear, pain. Other times, thresholds are about spaces of hope, possibility, joy, healing, and then there's a shift. But the truth be told about threshold times is that they hold all of that. And also something much more. Sometimes we can't always name what is going on, but we know there's a shift that we are being invited into. Now, as Anglicans, just like with Jesus, we are ritually baptized into the sacrament of baptism only once in our lives, be it as a child, a teenager, an older person. And that is irrespective whether we remain faithful to our baptismal vows and calling or not. God always remains faithful to the baptismal covenant, and that's what we recognize, which is why we don't do rebaptisms. Ideally, it's by the manner in which we live our lives, by returning daily into being enfolded and encouraged and incarnating all of what that means. The baptismal waters run through our lives, and hopefully we are refreshed by the Spirit in that all the time. So go back to the prayer book on page 380 and just read through that service to remind yourself of what it is you're called to live into. There is a wonderful tradition and understanding that is quite ancient around baptismal waters as well. And that is that sometimes tears, when we cry, can be a sanctification, a sacred provision of a form of baptismal water and an enhancement of the graces that God is working in our lives. It all depends on how those tears are being used and the intention behind that. And that's a tradition that comes to us from the 4th century, when St. Ephraim the Syrian, who was a prominent Christian theologian and writer, and he spoke of the eyes as 2 baptismal fonts. He writes about it in this way, and I quote, "For the Creator knew well beforehand that sins multiply in us at all times, and though there is a single baptism, he fixed 2 fonts, the eyes, that give absolution." So tears can at times be the body's own baptismal waters that can cleanse and heal and renew life. What about taking this a little bit further? What if by his baptism Jesus sanctified water? If that is so, then surely by the way in which we engage with water in our own lives, we can be part of co-inhabiting that sanctification. What if each time we washed our hands in water? What if each time we drank water or showered, bathed, watered the garden, if we chose to use that as an opportunity to remember our baptism, the promises that we made to God and God makes to us, and as we are either using the water or drinking it, we allow the words of baptism and of our scriptures to reinvigorate us and be embodied in us as we hear God saying to us, you are God's beloved child. I see you as God's beloved child. I own that I am God's beloved child, called and sent to make a difference in this world. After all, we need to own that baptism, yes, as a ritual is once off, but as a living is something that we remember and renew daily. Would you agree that, generally speaking, we're living in an era when so many of the more traditional elements of identity construction have been noticeably fragmented and diminished? Just think about it for a moment. You know, most of us, I think, in this church will have changed our jobs a number of times. Some of us may even have changed our careers. We've lived in a variety of homes. Even those of you who watch this online might be in the midst of setting up and moving. Some of us have moved suburbs, cities, even continents. And increasingly and sadly, we recognize that so many families are no longer intact. And so what happens is that in society, there's a growing craving and a yearning just to figure out, who am I? Where do I belong? Where are my roots? Which is the community that is my tribe, my people? And baptism is such a powerful way in which we can be reminded and owned and recognized as who I am in relation to whose I am, and that is God's beloved child. We belong to God's family, and baptism is a tangible sign of that. Let us hear again and again those words, you are my beloved, my son, my daughter, my child. This day I have begotten you. This day I have chosen you, and upon you my favor rests. In you I find my delight. That's an echo that's not once off. Every day, that echo, God speaks into our souls. And then we have that extraordinary image of the heavens being rent asunder. Did you know that that's part of a prayer that Israel prayed for centuries? And it is recorded in the Hebrew scriptures time and again. In many of the Old Testament passages, in Psalms, in Isaiah, and I quote from Isaiah 63, oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. And here's Jesus, the perfect answer to this centuries-long prayer. And when Mark writes about the heavens opening and that Jesus saw that, it wasn't a door that was thousands of kilometers up in the sky that was opened. It's not a literal door. In the Bible, when that word heaven is mentioned, it often is a reference to God's dimension, which is co-existent with this dimension of ordinary reality. And so that opening up of heaven is more like an invisible veil or a curtain that's gently drawn aside, and suddenly, in the midst of being in church or out in nature, the trees, the flowers, even the buildings, we suddenly are aware that there In Jesus' case, it would have meant that the sand and the water and the crowds suddenly faded, and he saw something of heaven's presence, which is with us all the time. And when we are gifted that, we are reminded, which reality are we choosing to live out of and into? Are we allowing the influence of society and earth to dictate how we live? Or whether we see it or not, are we living into heaven? Are we truly citizens of God's reign? Much of our Christian faith is actually about learning to live lives which reflect this alternate reality that is coexistent with us all the time. And for most of our lives, we walk by faith. And it's only every now and then. They're not prolific, because if we had prolific encounters of that veil drawing aside, I think we would be paralyzed because we keep waiting for the next event. And we would stop trusting God. We would trust in those episodes. But those episodes come when often we're at our most vulnerable, or at our most ecstatic, or the most ordinary. I bet Mary was just washing the dishes or sweeping the floor when the angel arrived. But through that story of Jesus' baptism, what Mark seems to be saying to us is, be willing, be available to the flow of the Spirit's power, which is always with us. And that power infuses us with the ability to see and hear the heavenly vision, the heavenly voice, just as we are, precisely where we find ourselves. And when we open ourselves to this, then we shall live in the steady flow of divine transformation and renewal, growing consistently more and more fully into the person whom God is creating us to be, and which Jesus' baptism and our baptism proclaims and validates as a reality into all eternity. Amen.